Serge Bodart. I know that you have a presentation, a short presentation, but I want to trigger and to stimulate you with a question to start with. So you are an expert of ePRO and eCOA, where ePRO, of course, is electronic patient-reported outcome measurement, and eCOA is electronic clinical outcome assessment. And as well, in here, the technology is not an issue. We have the questionnaires, we have the technology, we have the sensors. But what is the best way to optimize the validation of ePRO into strong clinical endpoint, so that then you can use them into smart and innovative clinical trials? This is my first stimulus to you. And then I have another one, but for the end of your presentation. Please, Serge, and thanks a lot for being with us.
Thank you, Alfredo, and good afternoon to all of you. Just to report, here in Montreal, we have minus 15 degrees this morning, and a little bit, I hope it's better in Belgium. Well, like Sophia, I would like to share my presentation that will answer your question, Alfredo, and let me know when you can see my screen.
Oh, yes. This is Montreal. Yeah, sure.
No, it's not, unfortunately. So, yeah, I wanted to start, I will take this from a clinical trial standpoint, because clinical trial, well, Benedict already started talking about it, about CROs. It's a special beast, clinical trial, and it's an extremely regulated beast, and so you have to understand why is it so difficult to implement technology in a clinical trial. And I want to take 5-6 slides to show you why we have so many difficulties. Already, Alfredo, you took, of course, by definitions, perfect. I don't have to do this. Clinical outcome assessment, patient-reported outcomes. That's exactly what the FDA is, where the FDA is confusing us with all kind of acronyms that they put in regulation. Clinical outcome assessment, you can read it here, any assessment that may be influenced by human choices, so it's really subjective, judgment, motivation, and may support direct or indirect evidence of treatment benefit. And clinical outcome assessments can be, there are 4 types: patient-reported outcome, and I will only define this one, the rest after that you will quickly understand. The patient-reported outcome is a measurement based on a report that comes directly from the patient or the study subject about the status of a patient health condition without amendment or interpretation of the patient's response by a clinician or another health professional. So it's really the patient reporting something about his or her quality of life, for example. I put an example, you might be familiar with that, health status SF36, it's questionnaire, 36 questions, very long, sometimes confusing for the patients. Then you have the clinician reported outcomes, the same thing, but reported by clinicians in this case. So you are asking questions to the clinicians about the patient functions, and a few examples here. Then you have the observer reported outcome and the performance outcome. Observer reported outcome, it's same as a PRO, where the questions are answered by the parents, for example, in the pediatric trial, or for elderly patient by somebody who's living with the patient. And then performance outcome, a good example is the 6-minute walk test. So we count the number of steps that the patient can do in 6 minutes. So that's probably more objective than subjective. I wanted to put this because I'm going to use COA and PROs in the rest of the presentation. And don't worry, it's not going to be technical. I want to concentrate on how can we bridge those different entities, eHealth, Digital Therapeutics, and clinical trials, and what is the difficulty there especially. Look at the eCOA industry landscape. So just for clinical trials, it's two years old, but you can do the math, and since it's an annual growth of 16%, you can see that it's not a lot of studies that are using electronic clinical outcome assessment. So capturing patient feelings or using a tablet or a phone, a smartphone, it's not a lot. It's only 1,500 studies that use eCOA. Interestingly, less than a fourth of the clinical trials using eCOAs are capturing these data electronically. So there are still, paper is still there in our industry, unfortunately. I've been in this industry for 20 years trying to eradicate paper. Well, 20 years later, paper is still a gold standard, actually. But there are initiatives to encourage collecting data electronically, and I wanted to cite these one maybe as a reference for attendees here who might not know about this. The Critical Path Institute. It's an American institution, non-profit organization. They are there to foster development of new evaluation tools and standards for drug therapy trials. But more importantly, it's a neutral third party that bring the industry, academia, regulatory authorities for pre-competitive collaboration and sharing of scientific data. So it's science, but with the different stakeholders. And there are two important consortia in this, well, too important for me. There are other important consortia, but for other people, the PRO consortium. So that's a group of 26 members, and those 26 members are exclusively pharmaceutical companies, and large one. And that group is in charge of qualification of patient-reported outcome measures. So those questionnaire, quality of life questionnaire that are built, so they are in charge of developing new one and accepting those in clinical trials. And then you have the ePRO consortium, where you have 13 members. Most of them, 90% are technology providers, eCOA providers, or well, it's moving a lot. So there are also CROs there that are involved, because CROs, as Benedict mentioned, are also involved in technology. And those people are in charge of developing eCOA best practices. I think that's important because you see that there are people coming together to develop some content about that. But you can ask, why is it so difficult? What are the barriers to adopting electronic tools in clinical trials here? And this is the result of a survey to the PRO consortium. So remember, 26 pharmaceutical companies. And these are the main aspects that came from that survey. It's difficult to use eCOA in a clinical trial because it takes a lot of time to prepare for eCOA for a study. And a lot of time means they need sometimes 3 months to develop a questionnaire on the platform. 3 months today, it sounds absurd because we can put a questionnaire on the platform in a couple of hours maximum, but there are other aspects that makes it complicated and that takes a lot of time. The cost is still outrageous. A clinical trial for a phase 3 trial using eCOA, and I'm talking only eCOA, you're looking at $1 million for that trial. So it's outrageously expensive. Site receptivity burden was also one of the barriers. You know, the sites, very often, we have to think about those people. We give them once it's an iPhone, the day after it's, well, like here on my desk, I have 3 phones. I have, those guys, they have even more than that. And so they are, of course, not, they're reluctant accepting the new technology because it's, again, they have to be trained and it takes time, it takes money. So to write site receptivity. Same thing with the patient receptivity, patient burden. Imagine 85 years old people who have to use their smartphone. It's becoming better, much better than 20 years ago, but still for some patient population, it is a burden. Training also, and then data integrity, device failure, paper backup. Very often, when I started this business 20 years ago, the eCOA industry, we were failing our trials because the technology was not there. The technology was failing. You know, my smartphone was crashing every 5 minutes. How do you want to record a questionnaire if your smartphone is crashing? So, but today it's much better, I think. And then those were the barriers that were found by the PRO consortium, and we responded, the ePRO consortium responded to those barriers. How can we move things forward here? And it was really about first starting collaboration between the different stakeholders. And I think that's the point here for us as well, between eHealth, digital technologies, and clinical trials. Talk to each other, because very often we are misaligned. We saw that in the eCOA world. Sponsors, CROs, providers, sites, patients, all have different expectations from the technology. Develop best practice. It's easy. Putting a questionnaire on a smartphone sounds easy. Well, no, it's not that easy. You have, because an instrument, a patient-reported outcome measures that has been developed by a scientist, has some properties, psychometric properties. When you migrate that questionnaire from paper to electronic format, you have to make sure that those psychometric properties are maintained and that you are still capturing the same thing as with the paper. Otherwise, your questionnaire has no value. Yeah. So those are aspects that we develop in the ePayroll consortium. So, and I summarize these. What's so special about eCOA? What makes it difficult? Those questionnaires that we are using in clinical trials are validated questionnaires, as I mentioned, with defined psychometric properties, very often used as primary and secondary endpoints. That has been the change from 20 years ago, where the patient was not really at the center of the trial. It was more the investigator. Luckily, we have changed that. There's been a shift in the last 20 years. Of course, now the patient is at the center of a clinical trial. And more importantly, I think it's at the center of all stakeholders here present today, eHealth, Digital Therapeutics, and clinical trials. That's something we share together. The patient is at the center of everything we do here. It's for the well-being of the patient, otherwise it's useless. So very often primary endpoints are used through eCOA. There is a lot of guidance from the FDA. EMEA is following more or less the FDA. Lucky us, at least we just have to focus on one. There are different eCOA technologies. We have smartphones, you have tablets, you have computers, and smartphones, different operating systems, different way to present things. So that makes things difficult when capturing patient data. All those measures, they belong to instrument owners, so scientists, and they put a copyright on it. That makes it also very expensive, because each time you want to use their questionnaire, you need to pay a license for that. You need to ensure version controlling, because those questionnaires are changing very often. So you have to make sure that the one you will deliver to the patient is the correct version, that it is collecting the right thing. So that's why all this, it takes up to 16 weeks before we can implement an eCOA solution in a clinical trial. And I have not spoken about translations, because there we start again. Translating a questionnaire means translating forward, backward, reconciliation, making cognitive interviewing, usability testing with the patient, making sure that the patient understands the translations. That takes months before we get it on board on our platforms. And then I have talked too long already. So apologies, this is my almost last slide. Measurement comparability. That's exactly what this is about eCOA. When you are using, I will take the first one, the vision analog scale. You might be familiar with the visual analog scale. A VAS is it's on paper, 10 centimeters, very often used for pain, where the patient will indicate how much pain he or she has. And then the site will measure where the dot is on the scale. Well, you could do that on electronic format. But what is the comparability? Is it still valid? Is the 100 millimeter on paper equivalent to the 55 millimeter on my smartphone? Is it not? So you see the point there, and this slide is all about this. EQ5D5L is an instrument, is a questionnaire developed by Euroqual. Also, how do we measure the comparability of those instruments on different platforms? And then, of course, today, BYOD, bring your own device. Everybody's trying to use the patient's phone. Do you know what type of, my parents are still using a Nokia phone. Do you think we can put a questionnaire on a Nokia phone? That's not going to work, of course. So we have to keep that in mind when we do clinical trials. And this is my last slide. So our bridge is the patient safety and well-being between eHealth, digital therapeutics, clinical trials. We have something in common. We share patient. But I think what we need to do now is bridge also the stakeholders, the different actors, talk to each other and develop and follow best practice, and then encourage publication, because that's how we are going to be able to use clinical trials data or eHealth or digital therapeutics data into clinical trials and vice versa. Thank you for this long presentation.
So,
attending it at least.
So thanks a lot, Serge. I think you more than answered my question, my initial question. I will trigger just a very brief reflection if I can. So given all these difficulties, okay, not difficulties, these challenges that I have to say normally comes by regulators, because they really need, in Italian we say, to split the hair in four, because they need to make this waterfall precision approach. So how do you see using these measurements, all of them, in creating composite digital biomarkers? So can we think about creating models and then validating models on all these measurements in order to derive biomarkers that can then serve as clinical endpoints? And how strong these clinical endpoints can be?
Yeah, there are initiatives already to develop libraries of clinical outcome assessment, because I think that's the key. It's to have something that can quickly be reused in a clinical trial environment, but also in a digital therapeutic environment, eHealth environment, something that everybody can pick. For example, I was talking about the VES. How can we use a VES in all those three areas, clinical trials, eHealth, digital therapeutics? Well, let's put guidelines together, and when you need it, have a library, we'll pick from that library and you use it. Same thing for those questionnaires. We're talking about translations. Have a library with translations where we can pick from. Of course, it's going to cost money and somebody will have to start that. But there are initiatives that have started with the Critical Path Institute. I like them very much, because I think that they have done in the last 10 years a tremendous job at improving the connectivities between all those stakeholders, and by developing best practices in this really rigid environment, which is clinical trials, of course. So question will be, of course, how can we reuse data? Because it's really at IDDI, we are doing clinical trials, but very regulatory. We do biostatistics, so we analyze data from clinical trials. So, and the founder, for example, is against real-world evidence, but that's exactly what eHealth and digital therapeutics is producing. It's real-world evidence, so it's data after you see in an environment where the patient lives. How do we bridge that? I don't have the answer. We're not there yet, but we are progressing. I think by developing best practices and by talking to each other, I think that's how we're gonna get it.
So, okay, this gives me a big smile, because it means that discussion is still needed, and possibly harmonizing not only an open innovation approach from one side for the technological development, but even the lobbying. We need to be really horizontal in the lobbying activities that we need to do, apparently, at this level.